Archives YouTube channel. Today's presenter, Amanda Salmon, a conservator at the Canadian Conservation Institute, specializes in furniture, wooden objects, and heritage interiors. She holds a honors BA in art history and English from Queen's University, as well as diplomas in collection conservation and management from Fleming College and cabinet making from the Algonquin College of Applied Arts and Technology. She has also worked extensively in the private sector for several museums and institutions across Ontario, including the Ontario Heritage Trust, the Ontario Museum Association, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Amanda is a member of the Canadian Association for Conservation of Cultural Property and the International Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works. And now, welcome, Amanda.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here with you. There we go. Great. So thanks everyone for joining me today, and thank you to Grey Roots Museum for inviting me to speak to you as part of their virtual lecture series. I'm Amanda, and I'm a conservator at the Canadian Conservation Institute, specializing in wooden furniture and wooden objects. I'd like to first begin by acknowledging that the land from which I'm speaking to you today and the land on which CCI is located in Ottawa is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Today, I'll be presenting an introduction to the Canadian Conservation Institute, which I'll refer to as CCI from now on for brevity's sake, to give you an idea of what happens at this federal cultural heritage conservation institute. And then I'll discuss a conservation treatment I've been conducting on a really unique object in the Grey Roots Museum and Archives collection, a horse-drawn winter hearse originating from Grey Roots from Grey County. The treatment is still in progress, and as you might expect, it's unfortunately on hold due to pandemic-related restrictions on access to our labs. But I hope you'll find what I've discovered and accomplished so far to be of interest. To begin quite broadly, conservation is really any action aimed at slowing or arresting the deterioration of heritage objects. The profession is multidisciplinary and includes aspects of chemistry, physics and biology, engineering, as well as art history, archaeology, sometimes architecture and anthropology, and of equal importance, traditional craft. The profession is guided by a code of ethics, which amongst other principles endorses an approach of minimal intervention and an obligation to respect the integrity and authenticity of the object. Heavy restoration is usually avoided these days in favor of stabilization. We strive to ensure that our actions are reversible and will do no further harm, so that anything we do can be undone without damaging the original fabric of an object or complicating future research or use. So CCI was born out of the scientific research labs at the National Gallery of Canada, but it became its own entity in 1972, and it's now what's called a special operating agency of the Department of Canadian Heritage, which just means that we have a certain amount of flexibility and independence. Our staff includes conservators, scientists, engineers, and other expert advisors. Our mission is to advance and promote the conservation of heritage collections in Canada through expertise in conservation treatment, which refers to the preservation of heritage objects through direct intervention to arrest or delay deterioration. We also advance our mission through expertise in preventive conservation, which involves mitigating risks within the object's context and environment that could cause future deterioration or loss. And finally, we accomplish our goals through expertise in conservation science, which concerns the materiality of the object and its constituents, and which informs both conservation and also interpretation. Our primary clients are heritage community entities just like Grey Roots Museum, but we also serve the Canadian professional conservation community and contribute to the international community by furthering the body of technical, scientific, and practical knowledge within our field. So I just wanted to draw your attention to this image, which shows my colleagues from the Conservation Science Division analyzing unknown at the time residues on one of Maurice Rocket Richard's Montreal Canadiens captain jerseys. As you can imagine, if you're familiar with the Rocket, many of these stains turned out to be blood. But this is an example of what we would call residues of use that in fact tell us much more about this object and enhance its meaning. So applying what I've mentioned about the code of ethics, conservation would ensure that these residues are preserved and not removed. I know it's a simple example, but I hope it helps to show how amassing and preserving this kind of technical information about our history helps to enrich our nation's stories and strengthen our cultural identities. So our facilities are located in the nation's capital of Ottawa. We have specialized conservation, analytical, and research and development labs. We have metal and woodworking shops, a photodocumentation studio, and training facilities. We also have a world-class library housing a really comprehensive collection of cultural heritage conservation resources. Our programs include, just go back here for a sec. Our programs include research and development, and some of the examples of our research include investigating material degradation mechanisms, quantifying damage, and developing new conservation treatment tools and preventive conservation guidelines for the museum environment. I won't discuss every image in my PowerPoint today, but I'll touch on a few for interest's sake. So in these images on the left and top right are my colleagues testing a material called gelin gum. This is a rigid gel that was originally produced by bacteria living on pond lilies, believe it or not. And it was used by the food industry as a vegan alternative to gelatin. If you're at home, like some of us, brewing kombucha in your kitchen these days, this is what you'd call a SCOBY. Our conservators have been testing its use for multiple conservation treatment applications, including stain and residue removal on paper objects. And on the bottom right, my other colleagues are seen here evaluating the effects of light fading on dyes and other colorants in order to help predict how artifacts will fade under certain lighting conditions. Another pillar of our programming is knowledge dissemination, and we accomplish this through publications of conservation resources, including peer-reviewed journal articles, web resources and videos, books and technical bulletins, and conference presentations and proceedings. We also support the heritage community through training. We offer both advanced professional development workshops and regional workshops across Canada for members of the heritage community on topics such as disaster preparedness and response, museum lighting, digital preservation, as well as conservation techniques and hands-on training like mount making and photodocumentation for museum objects. CCI also offers curriculum and postgraduate internships. And it was through the latter program that I started as an intern at CCI back in 2007. A large part of our work is service delivery, including conservation assessments and treatments, consultation including facilities assessments and materials analysis. Our Preventive Conservation Division provides services including technical reviews for heritage programs, risk assessment of heritage collections, and training on such topics as museum storage, planning and rationalization. And they also provide advice on matters such as museum environmental standards, pest management in museums, and packaging for art for transportation. Our Conservation Science Division offers services such as scientific documentation, like photography, radiography, and other imaging modalities, analysis of heritage object constituent materials. Another example would be using instrumentational analysis to detect hazards in collections, for example, such as pesticides that were once applied to natural history specimens to keep the bugs from eating them, but which turns out to be quite toxic for humans. Our Heritage Interiors Division offers advisory services, and at the moment this team is really heavily engaged in work within the parliamentary and judicial precincts in Ottawa. Our team is currently reviewing and providing oversight for aspects of the Conservation Master Plan for the ongoing conservation work on the centre block of the Canadian Parliament. And finally, we have the Treatment and Collections Division where I work. We also provide preventive conservation advice and training with regard to our particular specialties, but the main part of our duties involves conducting conservation treatments with two main goals: to provide support to museums with limited or no conservation staff for the conservation of treatment of their artifacts, and to research and develop and evaluate existing and new conservation materials and techniques. In the treatment and collections section, we have 6 different laboratories. We have our paper and books lab, where our conservators treat art on paper, photographs, archival documents, maps, manuscripts, and books. We have our objects laboratory, where our conservators treat 3-dimensional objects, organic or inorganic, ranging from something like basketry to leather to metal to glass to even to modern plastics. I just wanted to draw your attention to the image on the left. This is my colleague Monique Benoit, and she's using ground up dry ice, which is frozen carbon dioxide, and to form a sort of a snow to reduce soiling on a test object there. We have a lab dedicated to the treatment of organic and inorganic and often wet archaeological materials. They're quite a busy lab. Just thought you might be interested in that image down on the left. That's my colleague Tara Grant, and she's treating a mummified Ice Age caribou calf. In the middle, those are archaeological metal bits. That's the before treatment image. And then also on the right, my colleague Tara again welcoming stakeholders into the lab to examine an artifact from Johaven and Nunavut. In our textiles lab, we have specialized conservators treating objects such as clothing and costumes, tapestries, flags, samplers, clothing, quilts. I thought you might be interested in the image second from left here. These are my colleagues, Renee and Janet, treating the Confederation quilt, which was a quilt made from the scrap material left over from the dresses worn by the ladies who attended the Confederation ball at the Charlottetown Conference. It's a really neat object. We have a fine arts lab where our conservators treat paintings, polychrome sculpture. They do a lot of work in heritage interiors, as you can imagine, on painted interiors. And on the left is my old friend Marie-Catherine Steer when she was an intern at CCI treating a Marcel Ferrand painting. In the middle there is my colleague Wendy Baker treating consolidating flaking paint on the ceiling of the Senate chambers. And then on the right, one of our previous interns removing overpainting from the Royal Coat of Arms that hung in Canada's first Parliament in Montreal. And that brings us to the Furniture and Wooden Objects Lab, where I work. We treat furniture of many different types and origins, ranging from fine European examples to very simple vernacular pieces. And we treat a wide range of wooden objects, ranging from wooden vehicles like the hearse, to totem poles in the past, to architectural millwork. On the left, down below is one of our previous interns treating a model ship from the Musée de la Civilisation in Quebec City, which would have been hung from the ceiling of a church and was meant as a devotional object to solicit prayers for the souls of the sailors aboard the real life subject. In the middle is another wooden vehicle that we've treated some years ago in the lab, a medicine wagon. And then on the right, that's me many years ago treating a Victorian sewing table from Billings Estate Museum here in Ottawa that was damaged in a fire in the 80s. So collaborative projects involving all of our different treatment labs, as well as the different divisions at CCI are really what make us unique in our field and are one of our strongest assets at CCI. A good example of a really positive collaboration was this, what this image shows, which was the conservation of a terrestrial globe. And it was one of a pair of globes, the other being its celestial counterpart. These were treated by conservators at CCI. These were three-dimensional artifacts requiring the expertise of our objects conservators, but because they were plaster globes, but they were also covered with paper, which required the expertise of our paper conservators, as well as that of our fine arts conservators when it came time to remove the disfiguring yellow varnished coating that you can see they're removing in this image. And also furniture conservators to treat the globe's wooden stands, which are covered up here. So I'm just going to exploit the topic of collaborative projects to just segue nicely into the second portion of my talk, which concerns the examination and treatment of an object I've been working on for Grey Roots, a horse-drawn winter hearse, most likely built in the 1930s in the Shallow Lake area. So far, this has really been quite a collaborative project, as are most of our projects in the furniture lab, because the objects we see are usually composites, meaning they're composed of multiple materials. The hearse is definitely no exception. It includes wood, paint, metal components, such as the doors and hardware and fasteners. It has glass windows, it has textiles, and it even has leather. This treatment will involve the expertise of conservation scientists, documentation technologists, engineers and preparators, and wood, metal, arts, and textiles conservators. So it takes a village, as they say. But before we dive into the condition of the object and the treatment, I'll provide a little bit of background for you on the Grey Roots hearse. The Grey Roots winter hearse was fabricated around 1938, maybe a little bit earlier, for a gentleman named William Watson of Priceville, who was a local undertaker and harness maker. It's the only Grey County made funerary vehicle known to exist, and documentation speculates that the maker was Ralph Noble of Noble and Sons, a blacksmith and horse-drawn vehicle maker located nearby in Shallow Lake. The sleigh hearse was driven until 1952 by a gentleman named Tommy Curry to service the rural population surrounding the Priceville area before widespread automotive use necessitated plowing roads in winter in the country. According to the interview with Curry that was conducted in 1993, the hearse was used to transport the undertaker and the casket to the place of death and collect the deceased, as well as to deliver the coffin and sometimes the pallbearers to the funeral site. His memoirs on the subject are really fabulous, and they help to bring this vehicle to life. He speaks of driving the hearse through snowdrifts so deep he had to get out and lead the horses himself, or else get the pallbearers to shift their weight in order to advance the vehicle through these heavy drifts. He speaks of the farms the hearse visited, and how he would often assist the undertaker in preparing the body, which had sometime rested a while before the hearse could reach these properties that were essentially cut off by deep snow. So as you can imagine, Curry recounts the kind of sort of sensory memories one might imagine, like the smell. And he also has some really poignant memories about the general sort of pall and melancholy of the family and the entire affair, really. So this is an image of the hearse dated 1964, which would have been after the period of active use. The image was supplied by a Grey County resident whose grandparents purchased the Watson Funeral Home and its contents, including the hearse, in the 60s. She recounts that the hearse was in immaculate condition and was always kept indoors until her grandmother sold it soon after acquiring it. The hearse was eventually obtained by South Grey Museum from another gentleman who had acquired it at some point in time and stored the hearse in his barn. It was during this period that it's believed that the hearse fell into some disrepair. This image shows the hearse pretty much in its present form, minus a whole lot of paint and missing many of the decorative appliques seen here. But as I'll explain to you a little bit later, it turns out that this hearse used to look somewhat different than it does here in 1964. In service, the hearse was pulled by a team of 2 horses, which were hitched to either side of the hitching pole, which isn't shown here, but we'll look at shortly. The pole was coupled to the front bob runner, which is equipped with a 5th wheel that allows it to pivot and change direction as determined by the course of the horses. The horses were maneuvered with reins that passed through the rein ports above the dashboard and into the cabin, where they were manipulated by the driver. As an aside, maybe now you might be better able to surmise the origin of the term dashboard. Think dashing through the snow in a 1-horse open sleigh. The dashboard was a flap of wood or leather on a carriage that protected the driver from the mud and debris that was thrown back or dashed up by the horse's hooves. There's no braking mechanism on the hearse, and this was probably likely solely accomplished by a breeching harness system for the horses. The body assembly takes the form of a rectangular enclosed wagon with separate cabin and cargo areas. It features driver and passenger doors, cabin light panels, which are those windows that you see behind the doors, rear viewing windows through which onlookers could view the casket, and rear meeting doors through which the casket was loaded and unloaded, which we'll see shortly. The majority of the body is constructed from solid softwood of an unknown species at the moment, though I'm hoping to undertake some species identification soon. Some of the panels in the boards have the appearance of pine, and the floorboards appear to be ash or another ring porous species. The structure of the hearse is primarily what's called an infilled frame assembly, which basically means that parts of the frame show on the outside, though some areas incorporate a framing substructure. The elements of both the right and left sides are identical. So here's the proper left side of the body. And here's the proper right side. Here we see the front of the hearse on the left, and note the shattered front windscreen with a loss that looks to me to be about exactly the same size as an accurately thrown rock. And then we have the rear on the right with its two meeting doors. Here are some views of the interior. On the left, the cabin interior with its, as seen from the driver's side, with its simple wooden bench for the driver. And on the right is a view of the interior of the rear bed. This area is reported to have had ornate finishings and ornate carvings, but if they existed, they've been since stripped out. Though there is some evidence of what they might have been, and I'll discuss that a little later as well. All that remains now are some plywood floor panels covered with some lovely indoor-outdoor carpet, which was most certainly added later. Loading and unloading of the caskets through the rear doors was assisted by casket rollers installed in that cargo bed flooring. Existing hole plates in the floor panels indicate a beer pin system was used to immobilize the caskets in the vehicle bed and prevent shifting during transport. This is sort of like a peg in hole stop system to prevent any sort of weekend at Bernie moments, if you will. Sorry about the quality of this image. This is an image of a labeled image of the undercarriage, which consists of the chassis, which is basically the lower frame of the body, the suspension and the gearing. The summers, they're basically the longitudinal members of the chassis, are seen here. The auxiliary summers indicated here were components that were added later, and they're notable with regard to the treatment. So I'll discuss them more in a little bit. The bolster is sort of like a kind of a leaf spring that provides some pretty basic suspension. And of course, the beams, as shown here, are the members that tie the sides of the bobs together at the knees. Between the saddle and the transom, and not really seen in the previous image, is the fifth wheel mechanism that I mentioned earlier, now seen here. And as I said, this critical component allowed the front bob to swivel when the team changed course without disturbing the balance of the body. It's a flat horizontal iron ring that receives the wear between the bob and the body suspension as the bob pivots around the king bolt. The king bolt is this large metal bolt which connects the forward bob runner to the saddle and thereby to the bolster and the body. The gearing in this case, the bob runners, though that term can also refer to wheels, and in some cases carriages actually had both types of gearing depending on these were interchangeable depending on the season. But these bobs, the bobs for the hearse are constructed of a ring porous hardwood, again, probably ash. And this is just a schematic indicating the different parts. On the hearse, the knees are attached to the runners and raves with pegged mortise and tenon joints. And the runners are fitted with iron shoes to help them glide and prevent damage and wear. The forward bob runner is that traverse bob. It's called a traverse bob runner because of the presence of that fifth wheel, but the rear bob runner is stationary. And here, just in isolation, is images of the proper left side on the top of the front and rear bobs, and on the proper right side below. The hitching pole runs between the horses from the front axle of a wagon or cart to the chests of the horses. Like the undercarriage, it's probably ash. And with the team harnessed to the pole by means of the traces and pole straps, it served as a lever to steer and stop the vehicle. This is just an image I found on the internet that shows a team of 2 horses hitched up as they probably would have been for the hearse. I'm not a horse person, so there may be some inconsistencies here. I'm sure if there's a horse person in the crowd, they'll let me know if there were some differences. Incidentally, when the underside of the hitching pole was examined under normal lighting conditions, we saw faint stenciling, which was apparent in the area of the center of the shaft. When the same area was examined under infrared light, a maker's mark was discernible. When the digital image was enhanced, the marking really appeared more legible, and it's believed to read James Cowan & Co., London, Ontario. It's probably safe to assume that the hitching pole was purchased separately from a catalog, and we believe this is from a well-known London hardware store, James Cowan & Co., which is mentioned in several business directories as a manufacturer of carriage hardware. With regard to the decorative elements, so art carved hearses became really popular during the Art Deco movement of the 1930s, and they often featured these carved wooden panels that resembled heavily draped curtains, and they were placed on the side windows for privacy. The Grey Roots hearse sort of follows this trend, but it also shows some earlier Victorian Gothic influences. The form of this hearse, however, is decidedly vernacular and simple, with its square wagon shape and really simple construction, contrasting with the more sophisticated carriage forms of the high style hearses that you might be more familiar with. I personally think that the combination of influences here gives our hearse a really unique and eclectic appearance, which to me is quite quintessentially Canadian. Ornamentation includes rectangular plaques planted along the length of the garnish rail that were once adorned with applied scrollwork and cartouches, as seen in that 1964 photograph we looked at. What we call ghosting or witness lines, formed by the surrounding paint layers, delineate the shapes of the missing appliques. The mourning drapery carvings are composed of two parts. That's what you see on the left here. One part is the drapery carving with the tasseled rope tieback, which is fastened directly onto the panel, and a separate fringe carving, which is adhered to the top of the drapery carving. The drapery and fringe carvings appear to be mass produced and maybe have been hot pressed. Identical carvings are also present on the rear door, but these have the addition of these extension segments at the midsection to lengthen the draperies. This reinforces our assumption that these were mass produced and modular and likely came from a catalog, just like the hitching pole and probably like much of the hardware did. Each drapery panel on the body's sides is flanked by two turned split columns, and each one sits atop a rectangular plinth that was once decorated with a stylized acanthus leaf applique, now all missing. There are other decorative elements on the hearse, including some carved wooden blocks on the rear doors, like the one on which the rear door handle is mounted. You see the door handle in the middle. And the hearse's cornice at the top right here, it's just a little slice, a little detail of the cornice that's situated beneath the hearse's roof, is also considered a decorative feature. And it consists of several stacked solid wood moldings with different edge profiles. And funnily enough, in fact, we'll talk about it shortly, it no longer is a decorative feature, it's actually a structural feature now, which is causing some of the issues we'll look at shortly. So with that technical description under our belts, let's move on to the hearse's arrival at CCI. This required a lot of planning to ensure that we could get the object in the building, and it was a rather tight fit with only a few inches to spare on either side of many of the doorways on the way from our loading bay to our laboratory. So a little bit of sweating. You can see our relief down there in the bottom right image at getting the hearse into the lab safely. So when any object arrives at CCI, it's usually photographed right away, but unfortunately the hearse would not fit into our photo studio. I haven't really encountered that as of late. So we had to set up a temporary photo studio in a hallway at CCI in front of our spray booth, which was the only place we had the depth. It took 2 solid days to photograph the hearse, and it also included the use of a scissor lift to photograph the roof. After photo documentation, we conduct an in-depth examination of the artifact to record technical information and its current condition. A condition report is a highly detailed document that's completed for every object we treat, that records every defect, damage, and deficiency. We complete these reports as a means of establishing baselines against which we can monitor degradation and measure and evaluate the efficacy of treatments and preventive conservation measures. These also include schematics that map exact locations of the types of locations and types of damage. Examination often includes sampling and compositional analysis, as well as inspection under different lighting conditions, which might include inspection under raking light, which is when the light source is shined at an object from the side in order to highlight its topography. For instance, a good analogy I was noticing the other day as I was staring in the mirror that my wrinkles are really quite more apparent when the light is shining from the side. And this is exactly how we use raking light bounce it off the side to see, things that you might not see when you're looking at it dead on. We also undertake inspection under infrared or ultraviolet illumination, like you saw with the hitching pole, in order to see surface phenomena that is otherwise invisible in regular incident light. The general condition of the hearse is fair to good, but there are multiple minor to moderate condition issues. One may be more critical that we'll touch on, such as those outlined here. This is the abridged version of the treatment proposal for the hearse. And as I mentioned, our treatments are guided by our professional code of ethics and guidance for practice, in view of conducting minimal intervention and respecting the integrity of the object. So our proposals can be categorized, our interventions can be categorized according to intent, really, starting with remedial interventions. These are those actions that are proposed to arrest active deterioration or stabilize the structure of the object. These actions are considered necessary usually and should be taken. We usually recommend they should be taken in order to preserve the object. Then we have what we consider preventive interventions, which are proposed to mitigate the potential for future deterioration or losses. And these interventions are usually recommended to preserve the object. And then we have aesthetic interventions, which are aimed at supporting the interpretation and appreciation of the object. And these interventions are not required usually to preserve the object. So in the next few slides, I'm going to show you some condition issues and talk a bit about the treatment that's been conducted so far or will be undertaken to address some of these issues. So as you can imagine, after being stored in a barn for some time, all of the surfaces of the hearse were quite dirty. There was a pretty considerable layer of dust on the roof and other horizontal and difficult to access surfaces. There's also ingrained soiling and staining in various locations on the bare wood surfaces that are no longer covered with paint. It seems that an entire menagerie of animals may have taken up residence in this hearse at one time. We found rodent nesting materials and food stores, including a little cute snail shell. We found insect webbings and casings, and in fact, even some real live spiders when it came in the building. On the bottom right is an image of what are called flight holes. These are exit holes of adult wood boring beetles that at one point infested a few of the wood components on the hearse. It was determined that these infestations were inactive. However, the boring has negatively affected the structural integrity, making the wood a little bit sort of soft and punky in a few localized areas, but nothing critical. So I'm happy to say the majority of the cleaning using dry methods like vacuuming, which is always our first line of defense, have been accomplished to date, as well as some significant cleaning of more ingrained dirt with using cosmetic sponges, just dry cosmetic sponges to pull off some of the more stubborn dirt. So that's an image on the left of me standing up there with my vacuum, and I hope you can see on the right where I've cleaned on the right hand side and where I have yet to clean on the left hand side. This is an image of staining on the hardboard ceiling panels on the interior of the cargo bed. I've seen a lot of staining before, and the look and shape of this one seemed pretty familiar. Having once dealt with a raccoon infestation in a historic house down near the St. Lawrence, I was pretty sure that this was a urine stain from some kind of creature that had taken up camp in that roof cavity at one point. This is the roof cavity between the roof and this ceiling, which is inaccessible for us, but not for little creatures. So I examined that hidden roof cavity between the hardboard ceiling and the roof with using a borescope threaded through a little crack. This is like a camera on a snake that plumbers and contractors use to look in pipes and wall cavities. And as expected, the inspection revealed a whole lot of pest debris, webbings, some eggshells, and some just generally yucky things in there that I will need to remove by temporarily disassembling the interior ceiling panels. This is a more interventive action of the treatment, but in this case, we considered it necessary in order to remove that contamination, which in fact can attract other pests at some point in the future. So with our hearse, it's really important to talk about previous alterations first, because they've really impacted the condition of the vehicle, and there are many. There's significant evidence that multiple modifications were made to the sleigh hearse prior to 1964, because many of the alterations to the construction are visible in that 1964 photograph that we looked at. What remains unknown is whether the 1938 fabrication was in fact a retrofit of an older horse-drawn wagon hearse, with the alterations occurring at that time, or whether the modifications were made later in its service, but before 1964. The main components of the sides, the rear and undercarriage of the hearse are earlier than the front and rear, for instance, which have been significantly altered. And it's suspected that there was only one major alteration campaign, but unfortunately, the alterations were of inferior materials and workmanship. Probably the alteration with the most impact on the current condition of the hearse was an expansion in width. Substantial evidence indicates it was expanded by about 28 centimeters, which is precisely the length of this splice that you see here that's been added to the cornice and the roof frame. There are older hinge gains that are not used anymore that have been cut into the rear pillars, indicating that the original position of the rear doors. The existing casing styles were added later to fill in that gap when the body was expanded. They have this newer appearance, and of course the sum of their widths is equal to that 28 centimeters, which is precisely the length of that splice. The wood of the existing windscreen appears to be newer, with less wear and far fewer paint layers. There are large original mortises in the upper interior faces of the front pillar that indicate the windscreen's original position, which is slightly different than it is now. So we can conclude that the structural members that span the full present width of the body are replacements, including a lot of the roof and bedboards, the rear bearer of the chassis, the windscreen, the rain port rail, the dashboard, the footboard, the driver's seat, and the interior partition. So the original chassis frame is in good condition. However, these previous alterations to the undercarriage have created some structural concerns. When the body was expanded in width, those auxiliary summers that we talked about earlier were added because otherwise the chassis would no longer sit directly on the undercarriage. So these were needed to support and transfer the load to the gearing. But a lack of attachment points, or really kind of any, neat and tidy installation, has meant that the majority of the length of these summers are hanging unsupported, and they've suffered a lot of warping. And as well, the original summers are not centered on these auxiliary summers, so the weight of the body is not evenly distributed on these load-bearing members. And so as a result, cracking has occurred due to these poorly designed modifications. All that to say, in fact, the body is rather precariously perched on the gearing. We weren't really aware of that before. And to compound this issue, the proper left side of the rear bob runner is not attached to the bolster. So in effect, the gearing is not attached to the body here, as it most definitely should be. So it looks like the body was lifted at some point, and a missing nut allowed the bolt fastening the bob to the bolster to slip out of the bolster as the weight of the bob runner pulled it downwards. And when the weight of the body was replaced on the bob runner, the carriage bolt was misaligned, so it didn't go back through the hole it was supposed to go into, but instead it got squished between the bolster and the bob. This deformed bolt is visible. You see it in the bottom left there. And so to address these critical structural issues, we'll be conducting what I like to call Operation Lift and Separate, so we will jack up the hearse body on several locations, and we'll detach the gearing. This will also help to facilitate the treatment of the gearing, because it's actually a bit of a challenge right now to access all the surfaces as is. And we were having to sort of think about sizing up some teeny tiny interns to squeeze under there for us. But luckily, we've got a plan B. So with the body temporarily but more adequately supported on a temporary stage that we'll build for this phase, we'll also be able to get into the cargo bed, which we don't feel very safe doing at the moment in this current position, and consolidate some of the flaking paint in there as well, and conduct our repairs on the interior. I'll also add blocking between the summers and the auxiliary summers to more evenly distribute the weight of the body on the gearing. And these will be added. These will be reversible blocks joined with a suitable adhesive, reversible adhesive. The bolt will be replaced and a nut added to fasten that joint and stabilize the attachment of the rear bob. But of course, this work is pending the pandemic restrictions on group work at CCI. So hence why we're on hold a little bit here. Evidence indicates that the roof and the cornice have been raised by about 5 centimeters as well, because there's this conspicuous gap of that exact dimension between the top edge of the front pillars and the roof frame. The roof frame would have originally rested directly on those pillars, but it now sits on the cornice cap. This dimension also corresponds to the distance between the continuous ghosting lines across the upper infill rails that you see in the detail there, and the current position of the cornice, indicating that the cornice has also been raised. Several hardboard shims have been inserted between the body's head rails and the roof framing members as well. So as a result of those two modifications, this image shows details of some of the condition issues that were exasperated by those alterations. The roof used to fit like a cap over the sides of the body, but now it's only tied directly to the cornice. It sits atop it, and it's basically just sitting on top of it without any really strong joints to tie it in. The modified joinery was inferior, and the roof and the damaged cornice are now partially detached. There's a lot of rot in this area because the top of the cornice was exposed after the expansion, when before it was likely tucked under the roof, which would have overhung it. There's some evidence that also indicates that the body has been extended in length, and why not? You know, we did width, we did height, might as well do length as well. So some of the main evidence for this is the inclusion of these extension blocks that you can see in the bottom left that are fastened to the fronts of the summers with these big whopping iron mending plates and big giant bolts. Although much of the pointed nose is composed of newer elements, I'm still not sure whether the pointed nose was an original design feature. It seems kind of conspicuous to me, to be quite honest. And I'm not sure if maybe this started life with just a snub nose, like a square front. But when the hardboard patches that are on either side of the nose are removed, which we have to do because they're covering up some rot beneath them, it should be more apparent, I think, whether the nose is original or not, or that shape at least. So speaking of that hardboard patching, the lovely hardboard patching, it's on several areas of the body exterior that have been patched with this material. Besides the hardboard nailed to the nose, it's also been used to conceal losses in both lower rails on the body along the bottom edge of beneath the viewing windows there. And the material was also used to shim and fill various areas that were adjusted during the expansions. So for this reason, it's presumed that the hardboard patching campaign was contemporaneous with those expansions. Older hinge gains cut in the front pillars and alternate lock gains cut in the forward edges of the light panels of the cabin indicate the doors once opened in the opposite direction. They've been reversed at some point and rehung. There's faint ghosting, those witness lines in the paint layers around the split columns that indicate either an alternate column profile was once present on the infill styles, or that the original, or that the columns we see here were either repositioned or altered at some point. The garnish rail plaques have been raised by approximately 5 centimeters, and you see in the image on the right, corresponding carriage bolt holes in the plaques in the lower rail beneath them that indicate the original position of the plaque on the garnish rail. So they've been raised 5 centimeters. As a result of these modifications, there are a whole lot of old fastener holes that have been filled with a white filler material that's now exposed and crumbling and will need to be consolidated and perhaps sort of discreetly toned in because they're kind of distracting to the eye. There are many instances where the applied carvings have shrunk and lifted or suffered minor losses. There are areas that are at risk, like the lifting edges of the carvings, and we'll support those by inserting a material like balsa or some kind of compressible fill material underneath those edges to support them. And in consultation with the curator, we'll decide what is appropriate in terms of replacing some of these little losses that you see here. And in case you were wondering whether we will replace those missing appliques that we discussed earlier, the answer at this point is no, because we simply don't have enough accurate references as to what exactly was there. Yes, we have the photo, the 1964 photo, and we have the witness lines, but there's just still not enough available information to know exactly what to put in those areas. And it would frankly be inappropriate to take the artistic license to reproduce something without knowing exactly what was there. I just wanted to mention that there's no waterproof covering currently on the roof, but remnants of a painted canvas-like fabric are present between the laminated boards of the drip molding. That's the part that the molded, curved molded front of the roof. This fabric appears to be a vestige of a previous roof covering, and perhaps it's similar to an oilcloth tarpaulin, I think. There are also several detached elements on the hearse. Luckily, these ones have been retained, and they'll be reattached either probably using a stable reversible adhesive like fish glue. Here's one example. of the fringe that's been detached from a drapery panel. And another detached decorative block originating from the meeting style of the rear door. Luckily, we have all these great kind of witness lines on this object, so it's really easy to see where these puzzle pieces fit in. So we conducted microchemical analysis of the paint layers. This was undertaken in order to determine the original coatings and the order and amount of restoration coatings, but also as a means of characterizing their composition in order to help predict the solubility of these coatings. This is necessary information in order to inform our choices for cleaning solutions and adhesives and consolidants, because of course we don't want to dissolve the original surface. And this needs to be done, and consolidation needs to be done. We'll talk about it a little later, because as you saw, the surface coating is flaking and discontinuous. The analysis that was conducted revealed the presence of at least 20 layers of primer, paint, and varnish, which is normal because, you know, industrial vehicles were frequently repainted as part of an annual or a couple of years maintenance campaign. The earliest layers on the Hearse are a light gray oil paint primer. You see those on the left, followed by dark gray oil paint layers. And the earliest black layer found on the Hearse is composed of an unidentified natural resin, an unidentified drying oil, and bone black and Prussian blue pigments. So that composition is pretty common for a carriage varnish. The interior of the cabin is entirely coated with more modern black paint, and there are far fewer layers on the seat box and ledge than on other surfaces. The interior of the cargo bed, sorry, I don't have an image, but as I said, we can't get into the cargo bed so safely right now, so to be continued there. But the interior of the cargo bed features several paint layers, including a light yellow layer and a red brown layer of pigmented varnish. The combination of these layers of like a light yellow ochre first layer followed by a red brown glaze or paint layer is really characteristic of a faux wood finish. Faux wood finishes were often used to create the appearance of more exotic wood species on more modest softwood species substrates. This is something we see frequently with vernacular furniture that was made, you know, perhaps by a non-cabinet maker, but who was trying to make the piece look fancier. So we can speculate that the interior of the cargo area had a faux wood finish. So as I mentioned earlier, and is quite apparent in the images, the Hearse's surface requires some major paint consolidation. This had to happen before the majority of the structural and other repairs are conducted, since the paint, like if you just look at it sideways, it wants to fall off. So happy to say that the majority of this work, at least all the exterior surfaces, have been completed. Shown here is the lovely M.A. Hawker. She's an emerging paintings conservator who undertook this work for us. The work entailed many hours of painstaking work to inject an adhesive consolidant under all that flaking paint and clear off any residues from the surface. And she often had to use a heated spatula to lay down the curled flakes of paint after they'd relaxed a bit on account of the injection of that water-based consolidant, which act to sort of humidify them a little bit, make them settle down. Once the body is separated from the gearing and better supported on that temporary stage that I mentioned, we'll be able to undertake that interior paint consolidation of the faux finish. We won't repaint the Hearse. I know this is a burning question of many. Even though this is still a pretty common approach in the restoration of industrial vehicles, but We may conduct a little bit of sort of judicious in painting or potentially apply like a saturating varnish to the bare wood, because some of the destructive paint layers, some people mistake it. Some of the bare wood has this kind of white appearance, which has been mistaken for an intentional effect, a black and white effect, which is most definitely not what it's supposed to be. So there seems to be some interpretive interference going on with the aesthetic. So this is an ongoing this will be an ongoing consultation with the curator with regards to the best way to present the hearse to the public. The metal components on the hearse exhibit some corroded surfaces, but most of this corrosion is considered stable. The metal components will be cleaned and any active corrosion will be removed or arrested using something like a chemical corrosion passivator, may or may not add a protective coating. I should mention that many of our choices are dictated by the end environment where the hearse will end up. So it really depends on whether the environment will be stable or not. That informs the choices of the adhesives that we use. Other repairs will include, but are not limited to, replacing the broken glass in the windshield. And in consultation with the curator, we've decided to replace the glass on the side viewing windows, mostly as a means of protecting the interior of the hearse from dust and any visitors who might want to poke their heads into it. We'll treat the one existing leather rain port flap to remove mildew on the surface and then attempt to flatten it as much as possible. Will not replace the plywood floorboards, as they're now part of the hearse's history and its story, and which is the other reason why we won't remove the repairs, the alterations, because they are now a part of this hearse's history. And so with regard to those indoor outdoor carpeted floorboards, we'll just clean them up and repair any structural issues, of which are minor. As well, we'll clean and attempt to stabilize the holes in the cabins. The cabin has I forgot to mention, an oilcloth floor covering, which it kind of looks like a bit of a dog's breakfast right now. But I'm confident we can clean that up and stabilize some of the tears. So I hope you've enjoyed hearing about CCI and this historical wooden service vehicle with its sacred function and really eclectic aesthetic. Its significance is rich and really multifaceted, but I really like how it evokes this kind of sense of the permeation of pragmatism throughout all aspects of rural life in Canada before modern industrialization, including death and its rituals and its motifs. I find the thought of this severe black vessel skimming quietly through stark, secluded, snow-covered landscape behind a team of sort of steaming workhorses with a casket visible through the viewing window to be really quite poignant and regionally relatable, and familiar to me, if that makes sense. It's these kinds of deep connections to ourselves and our past that CCI and the conservation community try our best to preserve for future generations. So you just have to excuse a mandatory shameless self-promotion here. Please visit our website and Facebook page. Thanks very much for listening and for your time today.
Thanks so much, Amanda. We do have a few questions. I'll maybe start with the shortest one, and that you just talked about recently. The question is just, what was the paint consolidant that you used? What's the first one?
So we tested a lot of different paint consolidants, but we ended up using Lascaux medium for consolidation, which is sort of water-based acrylic emulsion. But We did, test natural consolidants as well. We always do a lot of testing, and we base our choices on factors like bulk and gloss and the ability to be able to clear it off the surface. So we'll see. We haven't developed the methodology yet because we really haven't been able to get into the interior to test consolidating that faux finish. But we'll see if we require another consolidant or if we use the Lascaux again.
And there's another question. What was the most challenging part of the horse-drawn hearse restoration, which you might not totally be able to answer because it's underway, but I guess so far, were there any residuals of use identified from the various lighting analyses? So
challenging aspects of were the paint consolidation, which took, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, several hundred hours of painstaking work. A challenge for me is also the fact that I am not an industrial objects conservator. And so it's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. And so it requires a lot of consultation. We've been in touch with colleagues at the Museum of Science and Tech. We conduct a lot of research to ensure that our approach is appropriate. In terms of residues of use, count the raccoon urine staining, but there is some staining on in the interior of the cargo bed. I don't really want to speculate what that is. No, not so much, but I think that the accompanying interview by the driver is so important at bringing this object to life. It really helps to give meaning to it, and I really appreciated having that research as well. I hope that answers the question.
That kind of brings to another question. Maybe just having read the memories, you might know offhand, or it might be a kind of generic question to funeral practices from that time period. The person has asked, was this for winter funerals? Can someone comment on whether bodies were buried in the winter without heavy equipment for digging, or perhaps the hearse was bringing the bodies elsewhere? And in some ways, they've partially answered their own question. I think once the frost gets in, you can't get into the ground. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add.
I can't speak to that. It's a really good question, though, and I wonder if you're a speaker coming up, right? Talking about cemeteries and burial, but that's a very good question. I assume that it, in the literature I read, it was used to deliver the casket to the funeral site. So there was a funeral going on, but it's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's sort of like, when does the transition stop between winter and spring? So yeah, great question. It sort of has an imaginative power of how things were. And then this is another question for us: is what is Grey Root's plan for exhibition and/or storage once they get the hearse back? I think we'll be extremely excited to get it back after all this effort. So yeah, we'll probably have to do even some more thinking about how we can celebrate its return. We do have an agricultural display building on site now, so that's great to have. But also, exploring our options, because we'll definitely be super excited after this very long process is over by the pandemic. Also, just thought, since we have the opportunity to ask a furniture conservator, just for people who are interested generally about their own furniture at home, if there's any advice you might have about just what are the simple day-to-day things you can do with furniture in your environment that will help keep it in great condition.
Well, as I tell my mother all the time, put down the lemon oil. I know it makes it look shiny and, pretty when you rub it in at first, but it's really not not a good idea. Any of those furniture polishes, as I said, we practice and we preach a minimal intervention approach. And less is always more. So in terms of your own furniture, probably the most important thing you could do is maintain the relative humidity in your house at a good, as close to 50% RH as possible, which is difficult for us in our houses, but humidity is important. Dusting, gently with to remove any dust, and sometimes you might clean things with a barely dampened cloth if you have spills or what we call accretions, which are just the residues on the surface. Barely dampened cloth with water, dried up right away, so there's no moisture. But I would say stay away from any of those potions that are sold as furniture rejuvenators, and just practice good housekeeping skills and try to maintain as best an environment in your house as possible.
Well, thanks so much, Amanda. I really appreciate all you've done. Oh, wait a second. There's one more question.
Sure.
Was there any lead evidence on the paint cross section?
I believe so, but you know what? I'm going to have in my records. There's definitely like white filler materials. So yeah, I don't believe we had a lot of lead, and I should say we only selectively did compositional analysis on selective layers as well. So some of the things in the middle of the sandwich is just not it's just not feasible to do compositional analysis on all of the 20 layers, but we were convinced it was safe.
Great. And there's another question. Are the glass window panels not original to the object? What was the decision process to remove them, and why not fix them and keep them on the object?
Yeah, so we will keep as much as possible. So there's the 3 panels in the 3 glass panes in the windscreen. The windscreen actually slides open. And it's the central glazing panel there with the big crack in it. We'll try to repair it. It's more the side windows that we'll, I think, replace. And like I said, just mostly as a means of keeping dust and things out of the hearse, and sort of adding a bit more to the holistic appearance of it. But we'll try. I'm not really confident we'd be able to repair that giant hole in the windscreen to look to not be really obvious, but we'll see. Again, this is where I'll have to consult with my colleagues who are experts in glass conservation, because I am not. So like I said, it's a collaborative project, and there will be many hands undertaking this work. So, and many of these decisions, your treatment proposal is sort of as best as it's your best educated guess, but it often changes throughout the course of a treatment, depending on what you come into and things that you weren't expecting. And so we will always strive to maintain the original material as much as possible, and only make those decisions when it's just there's a clear need, when we remove original material, when there's a really clear need for it, which may or may not be the case here.
Well, that's great. The last question is just a comment saying that they enjoyed the presentation, so that's great. Shout out from Fleming College. Yeah, and I again appreciate so much all the work that you and the CCI are doing about the hearse, and the time it took to prepare this presentation. Really appreciate it and learned a lot. Thanks.
My absolute pleasure, Karen. Yeah.
Take care.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.